Have you ever done something kind without expecting anything in return, only to realize later that it completely changed your life? Sometimes, the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. Picture this, a cold, rainy evening in a busy city. The streets are filled with rushing cars, headlights cutting through the misty air. People huddle under umbrellas, too focused on their own lives to notice anything around them. And then, there's a teenage boy, tired after a long day, standing on a crowded bus. When an elderly woman steps in, struggling to find a seat, he doesn't hesitate. He stands up, offers her his spot with a warm smile, never imagining that this simple act would set off a chain of events that would change his future forever. What happened next? Well, let's just say, fate has a way of rewarding kindness in the most unexpected ways. Hi everyone, welcome to Life Diaries, incredible stories where kindness always comes full circle. Let's get started. Ethan Parker was just another 17-year-old trying to get through the day. With a part-time job at a local diner and a full schedule at school, he barely had time to think about anything beyond making it home, finishing his homework, and helping his mom keep the lights on. His father had passed away when he was only 8, leaving his mother to juggle 2 jobs while trying to raise him on her own. Life wasn't easy, but they managed. Barely. That night, the city was drenched in a steady downpour, the kind that made people rush to their destinations, heads down, shoulders hunched, moving like ghosts through the misty streets. Ethan was exhausted, his feet aching from another long shift at the diner, his clothes still carrying the faint scent of coffee and grilled burgers. When he finally caught the last bus home, he let out a sigh of relief as he sank into an empty seat near the back. The ride was quiet at first, the bus rocking gently along the wet pavement. Then, at one of the stops, the doors hissed open, and an elderly woman stepped in. She was small, frail-looking, wearing an old wool coat that had seen better days. Her silver hair was damp, strands sticking to her forehead. She scanned the bus, searching for a seat, but no one moved. People kept their eyes down, pretending not to notice, lost in their own worlds. Without thinking twice, Ethan stood up. "Ma'am, you can take my seat," he said, stepping aside. The woman looked up at him, her pale blue eyes filled with something unspoken. Gratitude? Surprise? A sadness she had carried for too long. Whatever it was, it lingered just beneath the surface as she offered him a soft, knowing smile. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice gentle but strong. Ethan nodded, standing by the pole as the bus continued its route. He didn't think much of it. It was the right thing to do. That was all. By the time he got home, the moment had already faded into the background of his mind. He threw his jacket over the chair, grabbed a leftover slice of pizza from the fridge, and crashed onto his bed without even changing. Another day done. Tomorrow would be just the same. But tomorrow was anything but ordinary. The knock on the door came early, far earlier than Ethan was used to being awake on a Saturday. Groggy and still half asleep, he stumbled to the door and opened it to find a man in a sleek gray suit standing there. He was tall, with neatly combed hair and a leather briefcase in one hand. "Are you Ethan Parker?" the man asked, his tone professional but not unfriendly. Ethan rubbed his eyes, trying to process the situation. Yeah. Who's asking?" The man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. "I was asked to deliver this to you. It's important." Ethan frowned. "By who?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he simply extended the envelope toward him. "You'll understand once you open it." There was a strange finality in his tone, as if he knew that what was inside would change everything. Ethan hesitated before taking the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It wasn't just paper, it was thick, heavy, like something serious was inside. He looked up to ask another question, but the man was already turning away, walking down the steps, disappearing into a sleek black sedan that was idling by the curb. Before Ethan could process what had just happened, the car pulled away, leaving him standing there, barefoot on his porch, staring down at the envelope as the early morning sun began to break through the clouds. His mother, now awake, peeked into the hallway. "Who was that?" she asked, stifling a yawn. I don't know," Ethan said honestly, stepping back inside. "He just handed me this." He sat at the kitchen table, the envelope before him. There was no return address, no markings. Just his name, written in precise, elegant handwriting. With a deep breath, he tore it open. Inside, there were two things, a neatly folded letter and a legal document. The letter was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if the person writing it had paused, uncertain, before continuing. "Dear Ethan. You don't know me, but yesterday, you did something for me that most people wouldn't have. You saw me. You acknowledged me. And you treated me with kindness, not because you had to, but because you chose to. That is a rare thing in this world, and it deserves to be recognized. My name is Margaret Whitmore. Many years ago, I was a lawyer. I built a career fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, but somewhere along the way, I lost faith in people. I saw too much selfishness, too much greed. I stopped believing in simple, honest kindness. Until yesterday. What you did may have seemed small to you, but to me, it was everything. And I believe that people like you deserve a chance to do something great with their lives. Enclosed, you will find a scholarship, fully paid tuition to any college of your choosing. And, because I know that education is not the only expense in life, you will also find a financial gift to help you on your journey. No strings attached, no expectations. Just a chance. What you do with it is up to you. The world needs more people like you, Ethan. I hope this helps you become the person you were meant to be. With gratitude. Margaret Whitmore. Ethan stared at the paper, his heart pounding. His hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down and reached for the second document. It was real. A full-ride scholarship. And attached to it, a check for $50,000. $50,000. His breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. This had to be a mistake. Stuff like this didn't happen in real life. Not to people like him. His mother, reading over his shoulder, let out a soft gasp. "Ethan, is this real?" He could barely find his voice. "I think it is." Silence hung between them, thick with disbelief. Finally, his mother let out a small, choked laugh, brushing away a tear. "Well, son. I guess kindness really does pay off." Ethan looked back at the letter, reading the words again, letting them sink in. He had never expected anything in return for giving up his seat. It had just been the right thing to do. And yet, somehow, it had changed everything. He wasn't sure what he would do next. But one thing was certain, he would never look at kindness the same way again. Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after his mother had gone back to her room, staring at the letter and the check in front of him. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, excitement, and a gnawing sense of responsibility. $50,000. A full college scholarship. It was too much. He had done nothing to deserve this, at least, nothing extraordinary. He had simply given up his seat on a bus. That wasn't heroism. That wasn't some grand act of selflessness. It was just, decent. And yet, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, this woman, Margaret Whitmore, had chosen him. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, questions flooded his mind. Why him? Why now? Was it really as simple as an act of kindness, or was there something more? And what was he supposed to do with this chance he had been given? The next morning, after tossing and turning for hours, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't just take the money and move on with his life as if nothing had happened. He needed to know more. He needed to meet Margaret Whitmore. After a quick online search, he found an address. Whitmore and Associates had once been one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, but according to records, Margaret had retired nearly a decade ago. The office was still there, though, now run by a younger partner who had taken over after she stepped away. Ethan didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he at least tried to understand the woman who had so profoundly altered the course of his life. Later that day, he stood outside the building, a sleek glass structure nestled between towering offices. It was the kind of place he had never imagined himself walking into, the kind of world that seemed a million miles from the life he knew. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, making his way to the front desk. "I'm looking for Margaret Whitmore," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor, glanced up from her computer. "Ms. Whitmore no longer works here," she said. "I know," Ethan replied. I need to find her. It's important." The woman studied him for a long moment before reaching for a notepad. "She doesn't take visitors anymore," she said carefully, "but if you leave a message, I can see if she'd be willing to reach out to you." Ethan hesitated, then pulled the letter from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "She sent me this," he said. "I just need to talk to her. Even if it's only for a few minutes." The receptionist's expression softened. She scanned the letter briefly, then nodded. "Wait here." A few minutes later, she returned, scribbling something onto a small slip of paper. "Here's an address," she said, sliding it toward him. "She doesn't usually take visitors, but if you go there, she might make an exception." Ethan took the paper, heart pounding. "Thank you." An hour later, he found himself standing outside a quiet, well-kept brownstone in an older part of the city. It was elegant but unassuming, the kind of place that belonged to someone who had once lived a grand life but now preferred solitude. He hesitated before knocking, second-guessing himself. What was he even going to say? That he didn't feel worthy? That he didn't understand why she had done this? But before he could turn away, the door opened. Margaret Whitmore stood before him, her blue eyes just as piercing as they had been that night on the bus. She had changed out of the worn wool coat, now dressed in a soft gray cardigan and slacks. Though still frail, there was a quiet strength about her, the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms and making difficult decisions. "I was wondering if you would come," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Ethan swallowed hard. I'm sorry to bother you. I needed to understand why." She stepped aside, motioning him in. "Then come inside, Ethan. Let's talk." The house was warm, filled with old books and framed photographs of a life well lived. Ethan sat across from her in a cozy living room, feeling both out of place and strangely at ease. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You think this is too much," she said simply. "You think you don't deserve it." Ethan nodded, gripping the edges of his jeans. I don't understand why you chose me. I didn't do anything special." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "That's where you're wrong. Most people go through life only thinking about themselves. They see others struggling, but they look away. They pretend not to notice. You didn't. And it wasn't just about giving up your seat, it was about seeing me. A tired old woman, invisible to the world, and yet, in that moment, you made me feel like I mattered." Ethan listened, unsure what to say. Margaret's voice softened. "Years ago, when I was about your age, someone did the same for me. I was a scared, penniless girl trying to find my way in a world that didn't care whether I sank or swam. A stranger helped me when I had nothing. He asked for nothing in return, and yet that single act of kindness shaped the course of my life. I never forgot it." She gestured to the letter he had brought with him. "I've spent a lifetime repaying that kindness in whatever way I could. But lately, I've wondered if it even made a difference. If people still believed in helping one another, in simple goodness. And then I met you. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Margaret replied. Just promise me you won't waste this chance. Use it for something that matters. Ethan looked down at the check still folded in his pocket. He had spent the last 24 hours questioning whether he deserved it. Now, he realized that wasn't the right question. The real question was, what was he going to do with it? For the first time, he knew the answer. That evening, as he walked away from Margaret Whitmore's home, the city lights flickering around him, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Kindness had brought him here. And now, he had the power to carry it forward. This wasn't just about his future, it was about what he could do for others. And he wouldn't waste it. The next morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the check and the scholarship letter in front of him. The weight of it still hadn't settled in. He had spent the night replaying his conversation with Margaret Whitmore over and over again, trying to fully grasp what had happened. It felt unreal, like something out of a movie. How had a simple act of kindness led to all of this? He kept expecting to wake up and realize it had all been a dream. His mother, sipping her coffee across from him, finally broke the silence. So, what are you going to do? Ethan exhaled slowly. I don't know. I mean, of course, I'm going to college, but it just feels bigger than that. It's like I've been given this massive opportunity, and I don't want to waste it. His mother nodded, watching him carefully. Margaret saw something in you, Ethan. And she's right. You've always had a good heart. Maybe that's all it takes, one person believing in you, giving you a push in the right direction. He thought about that for a long moment. He had never considered himself special. He had just done what felt right in the moment. But now, he had a chance to do something more, something meaningful. He didn't want to take it for granted. As he was lost in thought, a sharp knock at the front door made him snap back to reality. His mother glanced at him, brow furrowing. Are you expecting someone? Ethan shook his head. No. He got up and opened the door to find another sharply dressed man standing there, different from the one who had delivered Margaret's letter. This man was younger, with dark hair slicked back and an air of businesslike efficiency about him. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and an envelope in the other. Ethan Parker, the man asked. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, that's me. The man extended the envelope. This is for you. Ethan frowned, glancing at the envelope. From who? The man's expression remained unreadable. You'll find out soon enough. Before Ethan could ask anything else, the man turned and walked briskly back to the black sedan idling at the curb. Ethan watched as he got in, the car pulling away as quickly as it had arrived. His pulse quickened as he looked down at the envelope in his hands. It was thick, heavier than the one Margaret had sent him, and unlike hers, this one had no handwriting, no identifying marks. His mother stepped beside him, watching the car disappear down the street. That's strange. Ethan swallowed hard. Yeah, really strange. They moved back inside, and he sat at the table, the envelope resting in front of him. His mother sat down across from him, her gaze filled with curiosity and concern. Aren't you going to open it? He nodded, though a strange sense of unease crawled up his spine. Slowly, he tore the top open and pulled out a stack of documents. On top was a formal letter, printed on thick, expensive paper. He scanned the first few lines, his breath hitching as he processed the words. Asterisk, Dear Mr. Parker. We regret to inform you that the estate of Margaret Whitmore is now undergoing final proceedings following her passing. As part of her final will and testament, you have been named as a beneficiary. Enclosed, you will find legal documentation pertaining to your inheritance. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the next steps. Sincerely. Mason & Clark Law Firm. Asterisk. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the letter, his stomach twisting into a tight knot. His mother reached out, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Ethan, what does it say?" He could barely find his voice. "Margaret, she passed away." The words felt heavy, like a punch to the chest. Just yesterday, he had sat in her living room, speaking with her, listening to her story, feeling the warmth of her presence. And now, she was gone. His mother's hand covered her mouth. "Oh, honey. I'm so sorry." Ethan shook his head, trying to process it. "She must have known," he murmured. "She knew she didn't have much time left." The realization made his heart ache. Margaret hadn't just given him a gift, she had left behind a legacy, something she had planned long before their paths had even crossed. She had seen something in him, something she believed in enough to make him part of her final wishes. His mother gently squeezed his hand. "There's more in the envelope." Ethan swallowed hard and picked up the next document. It was an official estate statement, listing assets, legal rights, and, his breath caught, another check. But this one was significantly larger. $100,000. His hands went cold. What is this?" he whispered, feeling like the floor beneath him was shifting. His mother's eyes widened. "Ethan." He shook his head, unable to comprehend it. Margaret had already given him more than he could ever repay. The scholarship. The first check. And now this? As he flipped through the pages, another note slipped out. This one was handwritten, just like her first letter. He recognized the delicate but steady strokes of her writing. Asterisk Ethan. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. But that is not a reason for sadness. I have lived a long, full life, and I leave this world knowing that I have done what I was meant to do. I always believed that kindness has a way of finding its way back to us. What you did that night on the bus may have seemed like nothing to you, but to me, it was proof that the world still has good people in it. I want you to use this money wisely. It is not a gift, it is an investment in you. In the kind of person you will become. I do not ask for anything in return, except for one thing. Pay it forward. One day, when you are able, help someone the way you have been helped. Give someone else the chance you have been given. That is all I ask. With gratitude and faith in you. Margaret Whitmore. Asterisk. Ethan's throat tightened as he finished reading. He had thought the first check was overwhelming, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. She had believed in him so much that she had made him a part of her will. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them away. He wasn't sure if he had earned this, but Margaret had made her decision. She had trusted him. He looked at his mother, who had silent tears running down her cheeks. "What do I do with this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She gave him a small, knowing smile. "You do exactly what she asked. You make it count." Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on the letter. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear, he would not let Margaret Whitmore down. He would find a way to honor her legacy, to live up to the faith she had placed in him. Because in the end, kindness was never just a single act. It was something that had the power to ripple through time, to change lives in ways no one could predict. And now, it was his turn to carry it forward. Ethan sat in his room long after his mother had gone to bed, staring at the envelope and the letter from Margaret Whitmore. Her words echoed in his mind, each sentence carrying more weight than the last. Pay it forward. It wasn't just a request, it was a responsibility. Margaret had entrusted him with something far greater than money. She had given him a legacy, a belief that kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways that couldn't always be predicted. But there was still something Ethan couldn't shake. Who was Margaret Whitmore, really? She had been generous, wise, and kind, but beyond that, she remained a mystery. The letter she had left behind hinted at a life filled with both hardship and success, but there was so much he didn't know. If she had gone so far as to include him in her will, he owed it to her to understand the woman behind the name. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He needed answers. He pulled out his phone and searched for anything he could find about Margaret Whitmore. At first, it was just basic information, old articles about her law firm, mentions of her work in high-profile legal cases, awards she had won. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that Margaret had been more than just a successful lawyer. She had been a fighter. In the 1980s and 1990s, she had built a reputation as one of the most formidable attorneys in the country, specializing in civil rights and consumer protection. She had taken on massive corporations, fought for workers' rights, and even led cases that reshaped laws protecting everyday people from exploitation. She had been relentless in the courtroom, never backing down from a fight, earning both admiration and powerful enemies. Ethan found an old interview clip from the early 2000s. In the grainy video, Margaret sat across from a television anchor, her expression calm but intense, her voice sharp and precise. "The law is only as strong as the people willing to uphold it," she said in the interview. "And if those in power choose to ignore justice in favor of greed, then it is our job to make sure they are held accountable." Ethan leaned back, processing what he had just learned. Margaret hadn't just been a lawyer, she had been a force of nature. The kind of person who changed the world, one case at a time. But if she had been so influential, why had she disappeared from public life? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating before typing in, Margaret Whitmore retirement. An old article popped up, dated nearly 10 years ago. The headline made his stomach sink. Renowned attorney Margaret Whitmore steps away from law following personal tragedy. He clicked the link and began to read. The article detailed how Margaret had suddenly left her career behind at the height of her success. The reason? Her only son, Daniel Whitmore, had been killed in a car accident. He had been a promising attorney himself, following in her footsteps, but one night, a drunk driver had run a red light and hit his car at full speed. He hadn't survived. Ethan swallowed hard. Everything made sense now. Margaret had spent her life fighting for justice, had built a career protecting others, and yet, in the end, she had been powerless to save the person who mattered most to her. After Daniel's death, she had walked away from the law, retreating from the public eye entirely. She had stopped fighting, stopped believing. Until, somehow, a simple act of kindness from a teenage boy on a bus had reminded her that the world still had good people in it. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why she had chosen him. He wasn't just a random kid who had been polite to an old woman. In some way, he had given her something back, hope. And in return, she had given him a future. He sat there for a long time, staring at the article, thinking about the woman he had only known for a single conversation but who had somehow changed his life forever. Margaret had lost her son, but before she passed, she had found a way to pass something on, to make sure that kindness and justice didn't end with her. Taking a deep breath, Ethan closed the laptop. There was no question anymore about what he had to do. He wasn't just going to take the money and go to college. He was going to live up to what Margaret had seen in him. He was going to make sure that, in whatever way he could, he honored the promise she had left behind. He was going to pay it forward. Ethan sat in his room, the weight of Margaret Whitmore's letter pressing on his chest like an anchor. The check for $100,000 lay on his desk, untouched since the moment he opened the envelope. It wasn't just money, it was a responsibility. A challenge. A belief that he could become something more. But that was the problem. Could he? Was he really the kind of person who deserved this? For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't just thinking about surviving, about getting through another day, another week. He had spent years focused on the next paycheck, the next shift, the next test at school. Now, he had something he had never had before. Options. A chance to choose his own path instead of having it dictated by circumstance. But that choice was terrifying. He turned over Margaret's letter in his hands, reading the last line again. Pay it forward. 3 simple words, but they carried a lifetime of meaning. She wasn't asking him to donate the money, to hand it off to someone else. She was asking him to do something meaningful with it. To build something. To become someone who would make a difference, just like she had. That night, Ethan barely slept. His mind raced through possibilities. He could take the money and go to college, study law like Margaret had, fight for people who needed a voice. But that felt too far away, too abstract. College was still a year away, and he didn't want to wait. Margaret had given him a gift, and he wanted to start using it now. The next morning, Ethan made his decision. He walked into the kitchen where his mother was making coffee, still in her robe, exhaustion lining her face from years of early mornings and long hours. She looked up when she saw him standing there, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. "I know what I'm going to do," he said. She set down her mug and gave him her full attention. "All right. Tell me." Ethan pulled out his phone and showed her a notepad where he had scribbled down ideas late into the night. "I want to start something. A foundation, maybe. Or a scholarship. Something for kids like me, kids who don't have a lot but work hard. Kids who just need someone to believe in them the way Margaret believed in me." His mother's expression softened, a mix of pride and concern. "That's a beautiful idea, Ethan. But it's a lot. Are you sure?" He nodded. "I can't just take this money and use it for myself." That's not what she wanted. "I mean, yeah, I'll go to college, but I want to do more than that. I want to help people now, not just someday." She studied him for a long moment, then reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I think Margaret would be proud of that." That afternoon, Ethan called the law firm that had handled Margaret's estate. When the receptionist answered, he took a deep breath and explained what he wanted to do. "I want to set up a scholarship in Margaret Whitmore's name," he said. "And I want to use part of the money she left me to help kids who need it." The receptionist put him on hold for a moment before transferring him to a lawyer who specialized in charitable foundations. The man listened patiently as Ethan laid out his plan, asking questions about how he wanted it structured, who he wanted to help, how much of the funds he was willing to commit. By the time Ethan hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. He wasn't just a kid working late shifts at a diner anymore. He wasn't just another high school senior trying to make it to graduation. He was someone with the power to change things, even if just in a small way. Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into the process. He researched non-profit organizations, talked to school counselors, met with lawyers to figure out the legal side of things. He reached out to local businesses, hoping to get sponsors to add to the scholarship fund. He even contacted old friends of Margaret, people who had worked with her, people who had known her before she withdrew from the public eye. Slowly, the pieces started coming together. The Margaret Whitmore Scholarship Fund was officially established with an initial fund of $50,000, meant to help students from low-income backgrounds pursue college or trade school. The remaining $50,000 Ethan set aside, determined to grow the foundation over time, to make sure that Margaret's legacy didn't just last for 1 year but for many years to come. When the scholarship was officially announced, Ethan was invited to speak at a small press event held at the local community center. He stood at the podium, staring at the modest crowd that had gathered, reporters, teachers, students, people who had known Margaret. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "I never expected to be here," he began. "I'm just a kid who worked at a diner, who caught a bus home one night and gave up my seat to someone who needed it more than I did. I didn't know then that it would lead to this. That it would lead to Margaret Whitmore changing my life. But that's the thing about kindness, you never know where it will take you." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Margaret didn't have to help me. She didn't have to leave me anything in her will. But she believed that small acts of goodness can make a difference. And she was right. Because of her, I have a future I never thought possible. And I want to make sure other kids like me have that same chance." He glanced down at the plaque on the podium, engraved with Margaret's name. "She told me to pay it forward. So that's what I'm going to do." When he finished speaking, there was silence for a brief moment before the room erupted in applause. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was something else. Fulfillment. He had made his choice. And he knew, deep in his soul, that it was the right one. As the event wrapped up, an older man approached him. He was well dressed, but there was something familiar about his face, something in the way he carried himself. Ethan recognized him from the old photographs he had seen in his research. "You're Daniel Whitmore's father," Ethan said before the man could introduce himself. The older man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I am." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Mr. Whitmore studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you. My wife, she never stopped grieving. But you gave her something she hadn't had in years. Hope." Ethan swallowed hard. "She gave me more than I can ever repay." The older man's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Then make sure you keep your promise." Ethan nodded. "I will." As he walked out of the community center, the weight in his chest felt lighter. He had spent so much of his life feeling powerless, believing that the world was something that happened to him, not something he had any control over. But now, he understood. Kindness wasn't just about a single moment. It was about what came after. About the choices people made because of it. Margaret had chosen to believe in him. And now, he was choosing to believe in others. This was just the beginning. Ethan Parker never set out to change the course of his life. He never imagined that a single moment, offering his seat to a stranger on a rainy night, would lead him here. But that's the thing about kindness. It has a way of echoing through time, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. Margaret Whitmore's belief in Ethan wasn't about charity. It wasn't about luck. It was about recognizing that sometimes, the smallest gestures hold the greatest power. A kind word. A helping hand. A moment of selflessness. These are the things that shape the world in quiet, unseen ways. And they have the power to change not just one life, but many. Ethan kept his promise. The scholarship fund grew, helping more students each year. He went on to study law, inspired by Margaret's legacy, determined to stand up for those who needed a voice. But more than anything, he carried her final request with him everywhere he went. Pay it forward. Not because he had to. But because he knew, now more than ever, that one small act of kindness could change everything. So now, the question is for you. Have you ever done something good without expecting anything in return? A moment where you helped someone, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do? If you believe that kindness has the power to change the world, then share this story. Let it be a reminder that the smallest actions can have the greatest impact. And if you've ever experienced the power of an unexpected act of kindness, whether giving or receiving, we want to hear your story. Leave a comment below. Tell us how kindness has shaped your life. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we continue to share incredible, life-changing stories. Because sometimes, the smallest gesture can create a ripple that reaches farther than you ever imagined.